Hi everyone, you've reached Lecture 7, the last lecture, Class Privilege and the Myth of the American Dream, to be completed by Wednesday, June 29th. This is the last lecture. I think what I'm going to try to do is put up copies of the PowerPoint presentations for each of the lectures on Blackboard in the next couple days in case you'd like to refer to them as you're working on your final analysis paper. So, in lectures 5 and 6, we discussed the ways that sex, gender, and sexual orientation are biological and social constructs used to categorize individuals and groups. The more we become informed about their historical legacies of oppression and marginalization, however, the less we see sex, gender, and orientation as, neutral categories, but really as stark and unbalanced hierarchies. So in today's lecture, we're going to be looking at class, which is also a socially constructed system of categorization, but carries obvious and explicit hierarchies even in its most basic vocabulary used to differentiate and rank individuals. So what is class? Class refers to the way that people are categorized according to their economic status. Now, determining an individual's class requires a consideration of not just how much money they make, but many different indicators such as occupation, occupation type, inherited wealth, family lineage, and social standing. As we examine the ways in which class is depicted explicitly and implicitly in the media this week, it's important to remember that class standing can form a strong basis for a person's overall identity, just as, if not stronger than, one's race and ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. And like race, gender, and sexuality, white patriarchal ideology seeks to minimize the diversity and difference of class. In fact, patriarchal ideology suggests that if we work hard enough, we can succeed, achieve, and move up the socioeconomic ladder regardless of the ways that our race, gender, and sexuality have traditionally held us back. In this sense, the promise of class mobility, which we'll talk about later this week, perpetuates a myth of a kind of a post-racial utopia where upper-class individuals have somehow transcended race and gender and sexual difference, and they inhabit an environment free of prejudice and discrimination and difference. And this is, of course, an idea that we will be critiquing, especially at the end of the week when we look at the idea of post-ethnicity and color blindness. So, throughout its history, the United States has always maintained that it doesn't really have a strongly defined class system, at least not as strong as, say, France or Great Britain or India. The framers of the Declaration of Independence repudiated the notion that only certain persons were endowed by God with a divine right to wealth and power, and they famously wrote that all men were born equal. Now, of course, we know that the Founding Fathers believed that only white men who own land should have equal access to wealth and power, since many of them are wealthy slave owners themselves. Nonetheless, this national concept of the freedom to pursue happiness without socioeconomic class barriers became crucial to the development of what we now know as the American dream, which essentially promoted the idea that class was malleable, and upward mobility was possible not through assistance or reliance from others or even collaboration, but through strict autonomy and self-sufficiency. Thus, accompanying the American dream was the ideology of the rugged individual, or rugged individualism, where each citizen was expected to take responsibility for his or her own success without the help of other individuals, institutions, or governments. Now, such an emphasis on individualism really worked against a sense of shared class identity and helped refine the dominant economic paradigm of the United States, which is capitalism. And capitalism is a system based on the economic competition among individuals, although more recently this competition has become among multinational corporations. So, under capitalism, success is measured purely through wealth and the things that it can buy, including commercial and political power. Thus, the American dream is typically defined in terms of material wealth, owning land, one or more homes, several cars, expensive jewelry and clothing, and so on. Now, some may argue that the American dream is about the pursuit of non-economic entities like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or the freedoms of speech, assembly, and religion guaranteed by the Constitution and Bill of Rights. But As critical media scholars, we probably know that even these supposedly universal freedoms are closely tied to economic success. The more money one has, the more ability one has to say or do what one wants. Now, the idea that class determines who or what has the greatest amount of power, and that those in such power can use their positions of advantage to suppress those of lower class standing, that really goes against the democratic ideals of the United States as a quote-unquote classless society, where the child born into the poorest family has just as much of a chance for success as the child born into the richest. Now, just as white patriarchy works to undermine racial and sexual difference in order to suppress the United States' legacies of oppression and discrimination, the belief in a classless society, or not having class consciousness, actually empowers the harmful aspects of capitalism, which actively work to disarm, mask, and suppress complaints based on class inequalities. So, this gets to the idea that in order for a capitalist society to function without clashes between the upper and lower classes, members of the lower class have to continue to believe in the illusion of upward economic mobility, even if such a mobility never actually occurs. Now, the American dream suggests that the only thing holding a person back from wealth and happiness is essentially their own lack of drive and determination. Thus, capitalism's appropriation of the American dream is what can be read as really harmful. Harmful for both members of the lower classes, who are taught that their economic impoverishment is the result of their own laziness or ignorance. And it's also harmful to the upper classes, who are taught to share in this belief, as well as to exercise a strong opposition to the idea that one's class or class consciousness really has anything to do with one's material wealth. So let's talk about how this idea has been critiqued. Most critiques of capitalism are closely linked to the cultural studies of class, and both of these are derived closely from Marxism, named for the economic theorist Karl Marx, who argued that economic systems like capitalism form what he called the base of society, while the institutions tasked with promoting the ideological beliefs of that society, things like schools, legislatures, media, and others, they're part of the superstructure, and the superstructure must reflect and endorse the economic system that produced it. So according to Marx's theory, there are always economic imperatives at the core of the superstructure. We have a few examples in American history that illustrate this. For example, because the American colonial economy was so dependent upon slave labor, schools and laws and newspapers from the 18th and 19th centuries promoted the idea of white racial superiority in order to justify and normalize exploitative capitalist practices. In another example, we can look at sexist advertisements from the 1940s and 50s, which promoted the idea of male superiority as a means of limiting female competition in historically all-male work environments. This was done to reduce any visible threat to the economic base designed to benefit men over women. So, American media are financed and produced through the economic base of capitalism, and therefore must repeatedly construct representations in the superstructure which uphold and celebrate capitalism. Now, we can see numerous examples of this in the media we consume pretty much every day. Movies and TV shows overwhelmingly center on and dramatize the middle and upper classes rather than the lower and economically exploited classes, and this is done mostly as a way of supporting and celebrating capitalism. And more often than not, the commercial media which illustrates that class difference does in fact exist in the United States only emphasizes how easily such difference can be overcome. And once again, this is framed through, the kind of grossly oversimplified notion of hard work and determination, although sometimes, as we can see in 50 Shades of Grey, it can be done with a mix of being swept off one's feet by a rich millionaire. Hollywood's tales of rags to riches success rarely offer a serious critique of the systems of rigid class oppression, which is really inherent to capitalism's continued success. Now, what's interesting here is that reality TV should, at least in theory, offer a glimpse into this harsh and all too real environment. But because capitalism is at the base of how such programs are produced and marketed, we are provided with media which really do one of two things: either reality TV that fetishizes the outrageous and fantastic material wealth of an extremely limited few, or reality TV which condescends, scorns, and brands lower class individuals as feeble-minded and lazy. And again, one of the topics this week is about reality TV's portrayal of class difference and whether it is condescending, which it has been accused of. So class consciousness is significant not only for recognizing the ways in which entertainment media ignore inequalities between the classes in order to affirm capitalism, but also because the class we belong to influences our own habits as consumers. So in the 1970s, there was a French sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu, and he began to theorize that that the people's taste, like gender, wasn't something natural or biological, but was something that was constructed socially, which we said at the beginning of the lecture. Now, Bourdieu used the notion of cultural capital, and that is the accumulation of knowledge we receive from the educational and cultural institutions we're exposed to. And what he said was that one's own personal preferences and tastes were not formed randomly out of a vacuum, but were very much predisposed from an early age by class and economic privilege. So, for example, if you grew up in a wealthy family and attended a private school and learned all about the classical arts, for example, your tastes and habits as an adult would be very much different than a person who went to a poor public school where classes were less structured or maybe didn't even go to school at all. So, if you were one of these economic elites, you might like classical music or theater or other forms of what we consider traditionally high culture, and you may look down upon things like rap music or reality TV as a product of low culture. Now, this might sound obvious and certainly has overtones of racism, but Bourdieu, who also sort of critiqued this notion, he observed that the social construction of taste had real consequences on class consciousness and society. Because a person is taught his or her taste at an early age and internalizes them, one's class is difficult to change, preventing upward mobility and preventing the American dream. Furthermore, Bourdieu observed that the cultural tastes of the powerful upper classes tend to dominate the tastes of the lower social classes, forcing the lower classes to conform to the aesthetic preferences of the privileged. And this might explain why, in school you learned about Beethoven and Shakespeare, but not necessarily Tupac or Biggie or, these products of low or mass culture. And this is because class, not individual taste, determines what kinds of media are most prized and privileged within our society. So let's talk about why this is important. Bourdieu's theory that taste is conditioned through class is important because it explains why each of us like the specific movies and TV shows that we like, and why these might be different from our friends. And of course, what Bourdieu would say is that it's not accidental at all. It has everything to do with our class. But even more significantly, Bourdieu reminds us about the importance that class plays not only in determining whether an audience will like a movie, but showing the ways that the movie was cultivated to reflect a specific set of guidelines and beliefs that in most cases reaffirm the economically privileged. So, for example, films and TV series that are marketed as award winners to appeal to circumscribed markers of quality established by the upper classes, or stories which either ignore the role of class in society or minimize its significance through characters that become wealthy in unrealistic or oversimplistic ways. So, as you think this week about how issues of class manifest themselves in the media we consume, as well as the socially constructed reasons why we might personally like consuming it, think critically about whether the American dream, as you understand it, is meant to sincerely offer hope to the economically underprivileged, or whether it's simply a delusion designed to prolong subordination of the lower classes by the upper classes. That is all for today. That is the completion of our final lecture. Woohoo, we did it. I will see you later in the week.